Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. This video is a mirror of my conversation with Rico Rants, which is also hosted on his channel as well, as I had the pleasure of joining him on his show, Rendezvous with Rico. I've been on his show before, as many of you are aware, and he's also been a guest on my show. We had a variety of topics to cover in a relatively short amount of time, but as always, it is a wonderful time to have when talking with somebody like Rico. With that out of the way, sit back and enjoy the show.
Bam. Good evening, folks. This is another episode of Rendezvous with Rico, and thank you all for joining me. Tonight I have with me a good buddy of mine who goes by the Progressive American. Connor, please introduce yourself.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me, Rico. It's good to be back on the show again. It's been a while since I've gotten to do one of these chats with you, but as Rico said, I am the Progressive American. I'm a staff writer, podcaster, and former staffer for the Elizabeth Warren campaign. I basically do video essays, response videos, podcast episodes every other week, and yeah, I try to explain politics from a historical and political perspective without getting too much into the hostility of personalities, though I sometimes fail in that regard.
Hey, don't we all? I say the key to making it in this game is temperament.
Yep.
It's having the best possible temperament you can maintain, because it's very easy to get heated and lost in the sauce in this. When it comes to talking politics, society, and culture, and even the best of them, it's to any of y'all out there in the audience. I say on to you, try your best to keep a cool head when discussing these topics with anybody, any lay person, because it's the second you lose your shit, it's all downhill from there. So with that being said, Connor, what did you want to talk about tonight?
So initially, when I sent you my message regarding some comments that were made by the Blaze's Candace Owens, I thought it would be good to talk about kind of the way in which her discussions and statements have unfortunately given off this impression of basically a bit of context. So Candace Owens has released a tweet a while back making the argument that the new plantation owners are members of the Democratic Party, and the implication being that black voters are on a plantation. And she's repeated this multiple times. And for years, this is her go-to line. And I wanted to talk about it because from my perspective, and admittedly I don't represent Black America, I don't know what it's like to be Black in America, so I'm not going to presume to speak about their experience.
As the CEO of Black Americans, I'm giving you express permission to speak on Black people in America.
Well, here's where I make my distinction. I am not a Black person, obviously, but I am a historian, and I have been trained in history as well as political science, and that is where my specialty is. And so whenever she talks about Black people, Black voters especially, being on a plantation for their support for the Democratic Party, one of the things that will always go off in my head is how little those kinds of comments actively represent the long-term struggle of political activists within the Black community over the last century and a half, particularly when it comes to how Black Americans ended up actually getting into the Democratic Party as voters and as candidates, and as well as how Black activists have been putting pressure on the Democratic Party for a long time to make their voices heard. The first time when Black voters, for example, were really getting involved with the Democratic Party in terms of a majority of them voting for the Democratic Party was in the 1930s. And the part of the reason for that was FDR and his approach towards dealing with poverty. And one of the things that was a key concern and still is a key concern to this day in the Black community is poverty and poorly run infrastructure, a complete disregard of housing policy. All of these things were as important then as they are now, perhaps even more so now. And so whenever somebody talks about Black people being on a plantation, they're misrepresenting a long-standing problem Did I hear an echo there? There was a bit of an echo for a
That
moment.
was my bad. I should have done this sooner. My bad.
That's all right. Uh, Basically, what they're doing is they're not adequately dealing with the fact that really that shift was on policy. That shift was Black Americans, Black voters being aware of their problems and looking for a political figure who would address them or, at the very least, call attention to them. And since then, there has been a significant battle within what some historians call the Black freedom struggle, which is the use of political activism to put pressure on institutions over a long period of time to shift the dynamics in the favor of the Black community so they can have their grievances addressed. One of my favorite examples of this, albeit it's a failed example, is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was run by Ella Baker and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a challenge to 4 senators who were running in the South and had won the Democratic nomination. Ella Baker and her activists ended up working to challenge directly the legitimacy of these senators, because during that period, segregation was still law. And their nomination to the party basically represented basically the segregationist control of the party. So from the very beginning, over several decades, Black voters, Black activists have been actually putting pressure on the Democratic Party to change to its will. And so whenever I see this kind of talking point, like Black people aren't plantation, Black people aren't really aware that they're being lied to by the Democratic Party, all I can think of is, do you honestly believe that Black voters are so naive that they wouldn't pick up on somebody lying to them?
On that note, I wanted to go back to something important that I think I wanted to, because I mean, obviously I was joking about it when I said I'm the CEO of Black Americans. There's something that was an issue once before, and I think still is to a degree, this belief that white people can't talk about the issues of non-white people, and then vice versa, anything like that. You have effectively, you're not an authority on these issues unless you are of that demographic. And I want to preface everything Connor has said up to this point, and will continue to say going forward, with the fact that that is utter bullshit. The reason being is because I will take anything a white man like Connor has to say over anything a Black woman like Candace Owens has to say. And the reason being is because there's a very clear, obvious sincerity and willingness to understand and educate from white men like Connor versus self-serving partisan hackery of Candace Owens. She does not care about Black people in the slightest. Hell, I would even go so far as to say she holds nothing but contempt for Black people. But who can say for sure? I don't know what's in her mind, but I know her actions and her words, and it shows nothing but contempt. In which again, contrast that with everything Connor just said. Understanding the history of blood, his willingness to understand the history of Black history, of Black American history, and our struggle for equal rights and representation, and just a better quality of life here in America. He cares. She doesn't. And believe me, it shows. It's really not that hard. So again, going forward, I really would like you all to understand that anyone can be an authority on anything. Do not disregard something someone has to say just because they're not of the demographic speaking on the issue. That is a cop-out, and honestly, it's just you're setting yourself up to be led by the nose by any grifter who shares your demographic, because believe me, there's no shortage of them in every demographic. So with that, carry on.
And I would also like to add that my ability to speak on some of these issues are not complete. The thing is, it's a learning process. Anytime you want to address something as massive and as critical to understand as racism throughout America's history, there has to be a recognition that the process is never 100% complete. There's always something more you have to learn. And that's why statements like Candace Owens, like Black Americans are on a plantation, not only reduces the political power that I have seen Black Americans utilize on the campaign trail, in in political discourse on platforms like this, that it reduces their agency to the point where it seems to me that they don't Candace Owens and others like her want to portray Black Americans as helpless, and that they need to be persuaded to switch back.
To better put it, as I said in the tweet, and I'll say it again here, the implication is that we don't know any better.
Yes.
If only we knew better, we'd vote Republican. If only we knew better, we'd be like Candace Owens. If only we knew. It's a combination of infantilizing as well as just outright condescending. You know, the implication that we could not that we are just being easily led by the nose by liars, and if we just knew the truth, we wouldn't dare vote Democrat ever again. And as you stated, with the history of Black American activism and our reasons for voting Democrat, we know better. We've known better for quite some time, and that's why we vote Democrat. And which also a fun game I like to play is ask any Republican why Black people vote Democrat, and they will even the most normie Republican will give you the most racist answer ever, completely unaware that what they're saying is outright fucking racist.
Oh yeah. Well, and I will also add that really what this discussion comes down to is a misunderstanding of how Black political power has worked. In the past, Black activists fought tooth and nail to keep the right to vote. In fact, to make it recognized in the first place. And they still have to fight for that. And we're seeing voter suppression bills all across the United States still. And redistricting and a whole slew of other things that are being used to destroy and restrict Black voting power.
Yeah.
But to add to that, sorry.
No, I was going to say that if they were confident that we'd vote for them, if we knew better, they wouldn't work so hard to make it hard for us to vote.
Yes. And to add to that, however, there is another attitude that I think needs to be addressed, and that is how powerful the Black vote is within the Democratic Party. If there were no Black vote, there would be no Democratic Party, period. They are the reason Joe Biden is president right now. Biden in Iowa was fundamentally a non-starter, but South Carolina, once that happens, once elderly Black Americans voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, it shifted the entire game. The momentum fell behind him and shifted the entire pace of the Democratic Party. So to be clear, Black Americans are not, nor will they ever be on a plantation beholden to the Democratic Party, ever. They are some of the most politically astute movements. Some of the most politically astute movements have come out of the Black community. And that tradition is being disregarded by statements like this. This theme, it's not just restricted to Candace Owens. It's not just restricted to a few people on Twitter. It is a theme in American politics that insults that tradition.
Yeah, because it's a thing we have coined, we call Black pragmatism. Because I want to be clear about something. We all know the Democratic Party ain't perfect for us. We are not, but I promise you, talk to any elderly Black person, they have no illusions about the many failings of the Democratic Party, about how the Democratic Party hasn't gone enough for the well-being of Black Americans, how the Democratic Party is beholden largely by corporate interests. Well, both parties are, but in the Republican Party more so. How a lot of their appeals to Black Americans are largely symbolic and not at all, not nearly enough of it is like actually the institutional change that need to happen, like again with regards to voting rights, how they just don't go far enough, and a lot of it is because they're scared of white backlash. We know all of this shit. We know. Yeah. There is no illusion whatsoever, and so to even imply that we don't know any better, that we just don't fucking know anything, and that we're just a bunch of dumb little lemmings that are just following along and stuck on a plantation. Like I said, it's one of the most racist things any Republican ever says. But boy, howdy, does Republicans and right-wing media love that talking point.
And it's not really meant for Black people to hear. It's meant for white people to hear. It is specifically targeted to an audience of people whose demographics are shifting uh, for the first time in the decline. And so they have to convince themselves that their fear is not fundamentally based in prejudice. So you have people like Candace Owens who realize I can make a lot of money off of this, or maybe she genuinely believes it. I don't know. But there are people out there who are willing to promote that kind of content uh, while ignoring some of the biggest issues to African Americans. Particularly, for example, in Chicago, there was an incident where a report came out that showed maternity deaths, the disparity among Black Americans versus, say, white Americans is way higher than it has been in the past. And then we also have things like disability. For example, the CDC in 2017 estimated that, I have it right here, 1 in 4 African Americans will have a disability. And yet we know from multiple reports that African Americans receive adverse treatment in healthcare, in their medication, costs, etc., when dealing with all sorts of medical problems. So any question about changes to the medical institutions or things like that, that's not going to come up in the Republican Party because that's going to require government action to fix, especially when it comes to race. Yeah. So it should surprise absolutely nobody when Black voters go take this and point to the Democratic Party and say, fix this or I'm not showing up on election day.
Yeah. And that's why Republicans, obviously they're full of shit, but try to champion colorblindness because for them it's a cover for not having to deal with the issues that are distinctly the cause of color, of skin color. Again, those distinct issues that are the result of racial biases and attitudes that have long persisted for decades, like the belief that Black people had thicker skin, like literally thicker skin. In the so it was okay to be rougher with us than it was to be the white people, and that was like, no, the only difference between us and a white person is our skin pigment, the color. That's it. Our skin is the same organ that it is on a white person. But for the longest time, it was genuinely believed that no, Black people had literally thicker skin.
So this is the other thing that I feel like doesn't get brought up enough. It's these ideas of how race interacts with people are almost solely restricted onto that color blindness perspective that you brought up earlier. When people say, oh, I wanted the standard of Martin Luther King, the content of their character, not the color of their skin. What they're ignoring is we haven't done that yet. Just because our legal system says we hold it true that these people have a right to be treated as equals does not mean the ideas that cause people to treat people, African Americans, as unequal in the first place went away. It just means that those ideas cannot be put into practice if they're caught. The enforcement mechanisms are inadequate, in healthcare especially. The Chicago Tribune story that I was mentioning earlier also mentioned that there was a 30-year difference in the life expectancy for Black women versus white women.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it's a lot of distinct issues like that they do not want to address. And the Democratic Party can stand to address it more. But again, Black pragmatism, we're going to side with who will harm us least. Because we know the Republican Party is outright antagonistic towards us. And then the Democratic, and if we have to choose between outright antagonism and just not going far enough, we're going to choose the people who are just not going far enough. If that's the best vehicle we have, even if the change is incremental and insufficient, it's better than outright antagonism. You know what I mean? That's what it boils down to.
And to add to that as well, I think one of the other things that doesn't get brought up enough and does not fit well with the Republican narrative here is their approach to really solving Black issues is to blame Black people. You'll hear this talk about, single mothers or welfare and things like that. But what they won't bring up is, say, the property tax system, how de facto segregation creates a property tax system that fails to adequately fund Black schools, or how there are many of these schools either will not have the necessary equipment to teach as many kids, or the these teachers will not have the means to deal with disabled kids in those communities either, making it further more difficult for African American, majority African American schools to adequately teach children. And that determines in a lot of cases, the path for a lot of people. Now, there will be examples of people getting out of that cycle, and that's wonderful. But nobody should have to be in that cycle in the first place. So the answers like that I see with Candace Owens in particular just fundamentally do not address any of that.
Because they have no interest in addressing it in court. Like that's what it all boils down to. Candace Owens exists to tell conservatives that no, you shouldn't ever. You're right. All the issues that black people keep bringing up aren't actually real. They're not actually real problems. You don't have to address them. You don't have to care. That's what black people like Candace Owens exist to do. That's what the whole of black conservatism is, which is a whole other conversation. But that's what it boils down to. Telling white conservatives there's nothing wrong. Black people are just lazy, dumb, lazy and stupid, and being easily fooled by the Democratic Party and want government handouts. Blah blah fucking blah. It's the same shit, different decade.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of plays again into Biden's nominee, can't pronounce things today, Judge Brown. How they're specifically focusing on like, well, I want you to prove to me that you are qualified to be on the Supreme Court. Tucker Carlson famously asked for her LSAT scores. And it's like, well, wait a minute.
You never asked that for anybody else. Why?
You didn't.
It goes back into the whole point that black people, especially black women, have to work twice as hard to be seen as just as good. And they have to. We have always had to meet a standard that did not apply to our white counterparts. You know what I mean? Asking for things that you didn't ask of them, and then chastising us for not being as good at the thing that you didn't even ask of anyone else.
Yeah, and it was the same thing with Obama. I mean, say what you will about Obama in terms of his policy. I remember even as a kid seeing like pictures of like Tea Party protests where they quite literally had hang in their Obama signs, and you know what they're implying there because they would draw exactly what they meant. I don't want to violate terms of service in terms of describing what happened, but you know damn well what was being involved there. But even like further to that, they don't. And Philoshai made this point in the chat, but one of the things that also goes into is this fear of addressing or acknowledging systemic issues. The response by Tucker Carlson and other conservatives when they see, oh, Biden is trying to break down this barrier of there never being a black woman on the Supreme Court, and that's the only thing he's caring about, when that's not the case. They were looking for qualified judges, but they were looking for qualified judges who would break down that barrier. So that first part of the argument from conservatives, they're only looking for a black woman, is another thing that keeps coming up. And I wish that more reporters push back on this idea, because quite frankly, we need to start saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't just like racist because they're bringing up skin color and they're attacking her with these standards. They're attacking her because she represents a change that Republicans and white Americans cannot control.
Yeah,
that's the distinction. And that is where I feel like the relationship between black Americans and the Democratic Party takes on another layer. Black Americans are not beholden to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to be beholden to black people if it isn't already.
Yeah, they just that again. It's just because of so many institutional barriers that make it harder for us to get what we want. Because, like I said, it's not. It's less about the racism within the party, which I don't really see is there, and more so corporate interests that just don't align with what black Americans largely want. Because black Americans do largely want, more so than even white progressives, a redistribution of wealth and better healthcare policies, basically the type of things that corporate America does not want. You know what I mean? So the racism and classism go hand in hand. And that's why it is frustrating as it may be, you cannot equate the corporatism of the Democratic Party with the racism of the Republican Party.
No.
Because the Republican Party's opposition to black issues and black activism is just purely fueled by racism and white resentment. Whereas the Democratic parties is just corporatism and political pragmatism. Again, the Democratic Party is terrified of white backlash, which has been an issue time and time and time again. Anything that spooks white people, or specifically white conservatives, is a boon for the Republican Party every fucking time. Like even with our max output, motivated conservatives will outdo Democrats generally every time.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I want to say is that there is a problem with the Democratic Party in its relationship with African Americans, in that the old guard has traditionally wanted African Americans to vote for them, but they're not quite willing to go as far as African Americans have been demanding of them for that vote. And Republicans have mistakenly taken the attitude that Black Americans and their frustration lie in a rejection of government. But the truth is, they're demanding their government actually treat them with dignity and fix the problems that they caused in the first place. It's not that African Americans are like, no, we want less government, we want to be libertarians. No, they are saying we have schools that aren't funded. We have a lack of trauma centers in the south side of Chicago. We have a lack of industry in Detroit. We have a lack of voting rights in the South. These things require government intervention. And Republicans and their narrative ignore all those issues, because if they had to acknowledge those, they would also have to acknowledge that America isn't just a shining city on a hill anymore. That's what they want it to be, because it never was.
Bingo. Again, hence why the whole anti-critical race theory movement is built on the premise of rejecting and demonizing anybody who's critical of America, because that's what it boils down to. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. You cannot honestly engage with Black American history and come away not wanting to criticize the shit out of America. You can't honestly learn Black American history and come away thinking America is the greatest country in the world at all times ever. You can't, because the Black American history, the Black American struggle is just completely contrary to that. And that's what they hate. That's why they don't want to teach it. That's why they don't want to recognize our history. That's why they're attacking Black History Month. Because again, to acknowledge our existence, to acknowledge our struggle, is to criticize America and largely white Americans in a way that makes them incredibly fucking uncomfortable. And they don't want to do that.
No, and the other thing I think is that needs to be brought up over and over and over again is the attack on history didn't really start until there was an honest discussion on race. Like that to me is the first sign that the conversations and the narratives you are seeing surrounding people like Candace Owens, people who deny the Southern strategy, and a lot of that are specifically focusing on restricting these ideas because, again, they know that with their current approach to governance, they cannot persuade enough Black voters to vote for them to win elections.
Oh, they've long since given up. Aren't even pretending to try. They again, that's where Candace Owens comes in, pretending like she's appealing to Black Americans, but Black Americans are just too beholden to the Democratic Party. But as you've already said, the shit she spews ain't for Black Americans. It's for white conservatives, and that's it.
And I will say that, to be clear, when I talk about this, I am not saying the Democratic Party is ideal for Black people. It isn't. It still has that old guard that views Black voters as voters and not leaders. And they have not come to terms with the fact that Black voters will eventually, if not already, are the motivating force between activism and really democratic mobilization. And the 1619 Project, I will say, as much as I have a problem with some of its approaches to history, one thing that Nicole Hannah-Jones got absolutely right was the statement that America wasn't a democracy until Black Americans made it one.
The mundo.
Ella Baker's understanding of radical democracy, the expansion of political, social, and economic rights for as many people as possible across multiple layers of class, race, gender, all of those things that she advocated for and that Kimberly Crenshaw advocates for are are part of that tradition. And it's so frustrating as somebody who observes this, mind you, in the abstract as a historian, not as somebody who experiences racism in the personal level, uh, to see this, because to me the black organizing tradition is one of the most impressive things I have seen in history. It's one of the reasons I really liked writing my thesis on Ella Baker. It was because I got to see quite literally one of the most powerful forces in American history that doesn't get enough credit, might I add, and yet I see it under attack again, over and over again.
And on that note, let's move on to the other topic we're going to talk about because we're 30 minutes in.
Alrighty. So recently, this is inspired by another comment by a user who I won't name. But basically, they were making a point that voting is not harm reduction. Now, I'm generally speaking, people have different interpretations about what constitutes harm reduction. But what I want to make clear in these discussions is that voting absolutely matters. America, generally speaking, has relatively low voter turnout compared to other countries, but shifts in voter turnout, even in a small degree, can have significant effects. So, for example, the Census Bureau noted that in 2014, we had some of the lowest voter turnout in American history since we started recording in the 1970s. But by 2018, we saw some of the highest voter turnout in a midterm. It was about 53%. That's pretty high. Midterm elections don't usually have that level of really support, and it was during that period that we saw a significant amount of change. And then in 2020, a 5% increase on the presidential election voter turnout from 2020. 5% increase. 2020. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit. In 2016, there was relatively low voter turnout compared to 2020. There was a 5% increase from 2016 to 2020 in the presidential voter turnout. And in just that 5%, we saw the first ever example in nearly 30 years of a president losing their re-election campaign since 1992.
Yeah. And on that note, I want to say with regards to harm reduction, let's give it a good example. Just take current events, the current crisis right now between Russia and Ukraine. You have to take all context into consideration to fully understand the harm that was reduced and understand who it was reduced for and to what degree. So to give you a very, very simplified picture, Trump wanted to pull out of NATO and try to blackmail, or he effectively tried to extort President Zelensky, Ukraine's President Zelensky, for them to create like a sham investigation into Biden so we could use that against Biden. And when I say extort, as in like you won't get weapons from us to defend yourself from Russia unless you give me what I want. You know what I mean? There was no commitment to protecting Ukraine, like as has been the case in prior administrations and with NATO. And Trump even wanted to pull out of NATO. That's been revealed by John Bolton, his former defense secretary. I think that's what it was, his defense secretary. I forget what it was.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, his former defense secretary came out and admitted, Trump wanted to pull out of NATO and was planning to do so if he got reelected in his second term.
I'm sorry. He was former ambassador to the United Nations, and then he was a security advisor. My bad.
Yeah. I forgot who the Secretary of Defense was. I'm trying to remember. It's not Bolton. It was. You looking it up?
I'm pulling it up right now.
Yeah, I forget who it was. Bolton was the UN ambassador, and the other fucking thing you just said, I forgot. But the Secretary of Defense.
Esper.
Who?
Esper,
who resigned, by the way, because of everything Trump was doing. He wanted no part of this shit. So you have to take into consideration, if Russia invaded Ukraine under a Trump administration, there would not be a united front with all of Europe and NATO, allies to arm Ukraine and help to defend themselves. It just wouldn't be there. Ukraine would be getting completely steamrolled right now without this. Like, of course, Ukraine put up a damn good fight even before we got involved with supply, giving them even more supplies and helping them. But they would have eventually ran out of supplies within just a few days, if not for the united front with the West, with the U.S. and Western nations and NATO arming them and supplying them with everything they need to keep fighting. Now, whereas with Biden, again, he united the U.S. and the Western nations in a way that has not been seen before since it's been decades since this has happened. This collective united front to stand against another imperial nation.
And I will say the other thing that is important to note in the unification of European nations and really the international stage against Russia, with the exception of China and India being a bit more hesitant to say anything negative, is that countries like Germany, for example, had every incentive to avoid condemning Russia for its military intervention and had every interest in avoiding annoying the Russian government. And yet the Biden administration and others were capable of getting them on board to the point where they canceled Nord Stream 2.
Yep.
And
countries that have been neutral to this point have not have come out explicitly against Russia, aided with the sanctions and aided with arming Ukraine. Again, countries that have been neutral for a long time now. He was able to unite the West. That's not so. Trump, on the other hand, went out of his way to undermine our alliances and to disrupt the U.S. and our Western allies, to the point that Germany had the German chancellor came out and said that the U.S. can no longer be relied on on the world stage. That's how bad things got.
Oh, and even without the foreign policy element involved, we had things where, like the ALS registry, which Donald Trump attempted to cut, which I'm really surprised that did not get a lot of media attention, because the ALS Association, as far as I am aware, were the only ones pointing this out. But he attempted to cut the ALS registry, and for people who have to deal with, the possibility of a cure, which the ALS registry is kind of supposed to help work with by gathering research data and information, that is a big deal. That was quite literally life and death for many people. And the president of the United States, for the Republican Party, wanted to cut it. Now, thankfully, that was a non-starter and it never went through. But think about that for a moment. We have the distinctions between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. As annoying and frustrating as both of them are, Joe Biden is not going out of his way to cut the ALS registry, and he was perfectly able to respond to what really was a surprising military action by one of the most powerful militaries on the face of the earth, albeit a paper tiger compared to the United States.
Oh, now we say one of the most powerful. I think that's been soundly debunked now by their own incompetence and just getting fucking their shit rocked in the thousands in a week alone. So
yeah, they're losing quite a bit of people. But I will say, when it comes, they still can throw a lot of people, and that's the distinction.
They can throw a lot. They got a lot of people they can afford to lose, which still isn't good. To be clear,
yeah,
shit, that's still not good.
Power is not the same as competence. It's just a matter of what can you do to your opponent, at least in war, at some degree.
Yeah, but you know what you were saying. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. But in terms of like the restraint, the control, the ability to make long-term plans, and to see it coming while other countries did not, is a distinction that really shows how important that 2020 vote was. Now, I am not saying, one of the things that I want people to remember whenever we talk about voting or policy making, we need to remember that there is a very strong section of people who are progressive, generally speaking, in their voting, in like what they would vote for, but they do not vote anywhere near as the older generation, and that is people ages 18 to 29. They are consistently the lowest percentage of people who vote. Their voting turnout, their registration is lower, And even though they are socially more liberal, they don't show up. And part of that, and I want to be clear, part of that is because the Democratic Party does not adequately incentivize them to vote. It does not do as much voter outreach as it should. But at the same time, it's also because we have a certain attitude that voting does not matter.
Yeah.
And 2020 is a direct rebuttal of that, because there was a massive increase in people within that voter group that actually saw an increase in their turnout. And so if you have, oh, you were saying something?
Yeah, I wanted to add on that is like you also got to take into consideration with the vaccines. Trump went out of the vaccine in COVID. It's already been proven that Trump went out of his way to withhold aid to blue states, to places that didn't vote for him. Whereas Biden has made it a point to make sure everybody gets what they need, regardless of whether or not they voted for him. Even though Republican-controlled states have been nothing but antagonistic to him, he is still giving federal aid to every single state. Yes. Again, as we were talking about harm reduction, you really have, like, the only people who says there's no harm reduction are people who aren't really actually paying attention. They can only think in the immediate of what benefits them and what doesn't. If nothing has, if nothing is on fire, then nothing is either. Their only way of understanding politics or any kind of change is either everything's on fire or we're in a utopia. Anything in between is moot.
I will say that part of this is also a systemic critique. Philo made this point in the chat too, that the Electoral College does make voting a lot less important as it would be in other countries. But I will also add that there is a very clear distinction between the level of voting that determines how much it matters. So, for example, Hillary Clinton, in terms of the popular vote, beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes. Now, with the historic voter turnout in 2020, Biden won 8 million votes, and he won a pretty sound victory over Trump. It was still close, but getting people to show up in the first place is a critical component of really protecting our institutions. And furthermore, it's not just the presidential elections; it's the midterms, it's the local elections, it's your city council, like it's your mayor. Or ballot initiatives. So for me, when it comes to the statement voting doesn't matter, it does. It's just we have not really taught our public to what resources are available to them to keep an eye on their officials. And part of it is because government websites are absolutely horribly run.
Yeah. Government websites have been just notoriously behind the curve. It always has been. And I really think we could do better to get people to increase literacy of the government from the bottom up of how the government functions and what's being done, so that people actually know what the fuck is being done. Like, because they don't know.
Yeah. And like that's the other thing. Like voting is unfortunately has always kind of been associated on the national level, and I would argue our initial conversations themselves prove that point, because that was the first thing we brought up. But at the same time, I also think that a lot of the discussion we have about voting should also be like a matter of self-protection. Like I feel like we need to start emphasizing this idea of voting as a matter of self-preservation and defense, because one of the things that if you look at the recent Texas primary, the turnout between Democrats and Republicans for their candidates, that the Democrats are significantly lower. And in that state, the governor, Greg Abbott, is now investigating trans people and the trans children, really parents of trans children, as if they were child abusers. But if we could get Greg Abbott out, we wouldn't have to hold our breath wondering whether or not the ACLU's investigation, a lawsuit against Greg Abbott, was going to be effective. Yeah. But because we don't have enough voter turnout, because Texas has effectively been Republican for so long, it's harder to create that environment, and these horrible policies that really violate people's human dignity remain on the board.
That's all there is to it. What was the other thing you want to talk about?
Oh, I wanted to add on the Russia thing. So this, I recently I don't know if you were particularly familiar with Jackson Hinkle
Yeah.
or Midwestern Marks.
Yeah.
You're from. I think I sent you some stuff on Midwestern Marks a while back, but there's this recent approach that I think it frustrates me to no end, and I want to get your opinion on this as well. It seems to me whenever there is any sort of discussion about other countries' militarism, their expansionism, their nationalism, people try to apply praxis or class analysis to these kinds of things without considering the worldview of the people they're analyzing in the first place, particularly Putin. Jackson Hinkle famously repeatedly said Russia was never going to invade.
Boy,
And
was he
now,
wrong.
oh yeah, exactly, because there was this skepticism, which is understandable, of U.S. intelligence, but never the Russian attitudes. Like there was never an attempt to go to like Putin's websites or government websites and read his speeches or get them translated.
So what was your question for me then?
So like what do you think? I guess what I'm saying is, what do we do like as online lefties or political commentators to kind of push back on that kind of content? Because from my perspective, it seems like there's almost an aesthetic on the left, albeit a small aesthetic, of I don't want to say this unironically, but anti-American bias.
It's an anti-American bias because the extent of their understanding of politics is everything America does is bad. You know what I mean? America can't be the good guys in any facet. And it's like a kind of reflexive contrarianism where they have to, whatever the American, because of opposition to a lot of the horrible shit America has done, they feel an almost reflexive contrarianism that they have to be in opposition to whatever it is the U.S. Government says. So if the U.S. government says this, they have to be the opposite. It's almost it's a fucking plague on the left. It's a goddamn just outright contagious virus on the right. Like their whole thing is that it's just weaponized ignorance. To put simply, like it doesn't make you intelligent for just taking the opposite position of whatever the mainstream narrative is, or whatever the government's saying. It does not make you intelligent. It does not make you insightful. It doesn't mean you actually understand anything. And I've realized that through my time, in online left-wing spaces and just my media consumption of politics on both sides, I've realized that there are a lot of people who, like the people that I used to respect, whose entire politics boiled down to made me realize that you're not actually intelligent. You're just taking the opposite position, and because you're reflexively taking the opposite position, and you were wrong. Kyle Kalinske was wrong. Jason Hinkle, we said, was wrong. Fucking multiple people on the left, like prominent left-wing voices, were wrong. They were all wrong. And it made me realize that the reason they were wrong is because of that reflexive contrarianism. If the U.S. government is saying this, well, no, it's the war machine just trying to talk a war. Hudda. And no real thought given to, no, maybe they're right. Maybe they're telling the truth. Maybe this time they're right about something and they have a good reason to be telling the truth. Maybe we do have reason to believe that Russia is an imperial nation and cannot be trusted and would absolutely invade neighboring countries given the opportunity to do so. You know what I mean? That's my take on it.
And I will also add, it seems to me that their method of analysis, and I said this on my video on Hassan, is to basically take an almost long-term look at the United States and assume all the interests are remaining the same. So, for example, like when they talk about Iraq, they use that as a pretext to say, well, the intelligence community said this and they were wrong. And to be fair, a lot of the CIA operatives and the intelligence community overall did not adequately represent what was going on, and they lied in many cases. Yeah. But it's also worth noting that there's very little examination of how they got to that point and who particularly was manipulating those reports, how they were presented to the president. Like Dick Cheney was a massive liar.
Yeah, that's what I want to point out is that you have to take the full context of then into consideration. The intelligence agencies didn't necessarily lie. It's more so that the Bush administration wanted them to lie. The Bush administration had created their own. When the intelligence agency wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear, they created their own task force to effectively come up to tell them what they wanted to hear. The intelligence agencies were telling the truth. They knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction. They knew that they weren't really a threat. But the Bush administration didn't want to hear that. So the Bush administration fired all those guys and brought in their own people who would tell them what they wanted to hear, and they got what they wanted. Even though, in hindsight, we know now they're willing to admit, yeah, okay, maybe we were wrong, but it's too little, too late. The damage is done. But again, you have to take that into context of then and then now. Like you said, the interests aren't the same. They haven't just stayed the same the entire fucking time.
And I would also add that I think it kind of actually goes back to the distrust of electoralism to some extent, because any examination of electoral politics would have revealed, oh, wait a minute, the Biden administration does not have an interest to have a war with Russia because he's got a midterm election going up. He doesn't have the same perspective. The voters do not have the same perspective they did after 9/11, where there was this unconditional rally around the flag attitude. While there's a bipartisan disdain for Russia's actions, most Americans are not going to be going out of their way to say, let's go to war with Russia, let's risk nuclear war. And that never came up either, particularly in Eddie's comments about the corporate media warmongering, while ignoring that many of these reporters like Christopher Miller of BuzzFeed were there. They were talking to people who were there. There was a serious examination. There were reporters who literally asked intelligence operatives, why should we believe you? And the intelligence operative didn't really respond appropriately. But the fact that there was now a media environment that actually questioned it does suggest, in my opinion, the conditions that created an Iraq war, while not entirely gone, are nowhere near as bad as they once were.
Exactly. And that's really all it comes down to. In my advice to everyone going forward, because we're nearing the end. My wife is bugging the shit out of me for me to come go, where she is right now. Try to think things with a clear fucking head. Incentives change. People change. Times have changed. Information is alive. As I like to put it, or as one other person put it, imagine information is like a living, breathing thing that is always changing and adapting at all fucking times. All right? Do not go into any issue with the mindset that you already know the answer, being based off of prior information.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Whatever was the things were in the past, that was then, this is now. So keep an open mind, keep your head on a swivel, and understand that you need to try it. Just don't be a fucking contrarian. All right, that's the lazy man's way of trying to be smart.
And I'll leave this as my final remark. All problems have multiple causes, and if you're looking for a single overarching problem to blame it on, chances are you're going to miss a massive current of a network of problems that will end up embarrassing the hell out of you. And I think a lot of people on the online left were embarrassed, and others just don't want to admit that they were wrong in the first place.
Yeah. You fuck all that, period. But that's all I got for y'all. All right, Connor, it was a pleasure having you on again. Same as always, for real.
Pleasure to be on.
And to the audience, thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Enjoy your weekend. I'll be on again tomorrow with someone else. Maybe, depends on if they can make it. If not, it is what it is. I'll just be playing video games then, or writing this essay I have to work on. Whatever the card land on tomorrow. We'll see. But y'all have a great night and take care.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to my channel as well as Rico's. I'd like to thank Rico for having me on, and as always, he is always welcome on the show as well. I plan to do more of this kind of content in the future since I really do enjoy sitting down and talking with people, whether it's casually or more interview based. If there is anyone you would like to see on the show, feel free to comment their name, their work, or anything else that would help me find them. As always, thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.